So I'm going to do my little showman thing now, okay? So just bear with me and don't judge me. All right, welcome everybody to episode 79 of the Inglorious Bastards campaign. With me tonight, I'm very honored to have another Tolkien expert, another local Boston Tolkien expert for that matter. So with me tonight, I have Michael Drout, who is the chair of the Department of English at Wheaton College, among other things. He is also the author of at least 13 courses in the Modern Scholars series. He's the editor of many books and also a lecturer at Signum University. So welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's my pleasure, my pleasure. So I'd like to start off tonight right away, just getting into the meat of it. And you and I had talked sort of electronically about this, but if you do your research and you're really a Tolkien enthusiast, you in doing the research you find that a lot of Tolkien scholars have this. It's like their entry point to Tolkien for their students or for the people that follow them are to explain how to read Tolkien. So I was wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about why does everyone seem to need to clarify like how you read Tolkien?
How to read one of the most popular books in the entire 20th century?
Yeah.
I think the reason is that all of us who work in Tolkien in one way or the other are just very aware that he's different than the stuff that we were trained to read and trained to analyze in undergrad and grad school. That there's something different about it, and that if you try to read it as a realistic novel or something like Moby Dick or Shakespeare or anything like that, you read it wrong. Like you're looking for the wrong things. It's like arguing about silly things that would be plot holes or well, how come when Frodo has the ring on he's not blind, since the light would be passing right through his retina, and kind of like Sheldon Big Bang Theory type questions.
Yeah.
So there's that part of it, but and on the other side, it's like the literary scholarship piece. We who love Tolkien, we get it. Like you get it intuitively. What the way the book works, the way the story works, whether it's the magic system in the world or the bigger point about whose point of view you're getting for the story and so forth. But I think everybody feels like you've got to explain that to your colleagues because of partly, it's this defensiveness that I've been arguing, and in fact in my book that I'm still not finished with, have a big piece on, like, basically saying, stop already. Like, okay, we're now far enough along that we no longer have to be defensive about Tolkien. There's enough like critical scholarly infrastructure. There's enough work that's been done on it. I think it's become clear now that this is in fact one of the most culturally influential books of the 20th century. And so, like, stop apologizing and just get going. But it's very tempting too, because especially when you're dealing with like mainstream critics, they just say such stupid things that it's just so tempting to catch them in their own contradictions. That's Shippey's favorite. Find something that a critic says, all great works of art do this, and then you show exactly how Tolkien did that, and then you find the same critic saying Tolkien's not good.
Yeah, right.
So,
do you think that these critics that you mentioned are used to critiquing something like Tolkien? I mean, is there anything like Tolkien in contemporary literature?
Well, there is now, or there are things that given enough time now, you can start to see the connections that maybe you couldn't see before, right? You started to think it seemed like that Tolkien was one of its own, it's a totally new thing. So you didn't necessarily put him with all his his influences, his sources, the things that he pulled together.
Right.
And you can see him also as like kind of a node in a network where all the imitations of him and the development of the field of fantasy. And then you can put it in this like larger context. You know, there's those for example, the primarily Latin American writers who wrote in the field of like magical realism, it was called. And there's some like Borges and Gabriel García Márquez, and in England, Angela Carter. Like there's other, and they weren't very. There's a lot of things about those that are really different from Tolkien, but kind of in the fullness of time, you can see that there was sort of something going on in the 20th century about fantasy, about magic, about re-envisioning and redeveloping these deep cultural traditions, and that different writers handled it different ways. So in some ways then Tolkien becomes not as like weird that like literary scholars would say, well, come on, it's got elves. You can't have elves in a serious book. And at the same time, you can sort of see what his achievement was. Tolkien, like, pulled together. It wasn't so much that he invented. I mean, he invented lots of new things within his work, but he's pulling together, like, the imagined manuscript tradition and the map of place that doesn't exist tradition and invented language tradition and the sort of pseudo-medieval world tradition. Now, and once he does that, right, that's like the stable core of all fantasy after that. But none of those things came out of nowhere. Even the invented languages, there were precedents and other things. His part of his genius, and his genius worked in a lot of different ways, was to like assemble the prototype fantasy novel that then everyone else says, oh, now I know how to do this. But the weird thing is none of them surpassed him, even though, you know, you'd think that someone would come along, like, so let's just say, like, for the sake of argument, it's not entirely true, but it's close enough, that Virginia Woolf invents stream of consciousness, right? But then I think most people would say James Joyce perfected it. The thing is, like, Tolkien invented the massive, epic, imagined world fantasy novel with maps and languages and appendices and that kind of, you know, compendious world, but you can't say anyone else like did it better.
I would say it's all downhill from there. But
I mean, there are things that peek through. I think Ursula Le Guin's Earthsea, certainly not like developed to the extent of Middle Earth, but it has its own integrity. I know Shippey thinks, I think it's Michael Swanwick, that he thinks has done a great job there, and I think that there's some more of the recent fantasy, because with the invention of urban fantasy, it let people get out from under Tolkien's shadow enough to stop either imitating or eating and reacting against the Lord of the Rings and just write their own stuff.
Yeah.
You know, like that's why I would say Laini Taylor's Daughter of Smoke and Bone trilogy is one of the best pieces of fantasy I've read in 15 years, and it's really outside the shadow of Tolkien.
Well, I'll try to. I'll do my best to take some of the authors that you mentioned and put them in the description of this episode, so people can find them if they want. If I could, I remember listening to there was a. People can find this online. There was a lecture, or I think you were a guest lecturer at Carnegie Mellon. There's a video out, sort of on the interwebs.
Yeah.
And one of the things that you said, and the topic of this was sort of, you talked about a lot of things, but the topic was, you know, how do you read Tolkien? And you said at one point, you read Tolkien as a philologist would read something, and it's funny that you say that, because the most recent interview that we had here was with James Tauber, who I referred to as the digital philologist, and he said, he actually quoted Roman Jakobson, who said, what is philology? It is the art of reading slowly. So
I like that a lot. Yeah. That's a great quote.
So is that how you read Tolkien? Very, very slowly?
Well, I read Tolkien very, very many times. I think I lost count, but at one point I had read The Lord of the Rings 42 times because I'd read it every year. When I was, I don't know, when we first read it was 8 years old maybe or something. My dad read it out loud to me, and then as soon as we got to the end, we would start reading it again. And I just read it every year for the longest time. And so you pick up more and more stuff. So that's, I guess, that's like, reading it fast many times is maybe the same as reading it slowly once.
It's funny. I'm reading The Hobbit to my daughter now, who's 8 years old, and just the amount of things that I'm picking up, reading it out loud, and talking with her about it is pretty amazing. But let me ask you about this. So I found a paper online, a document that you had written with probably some of your students. It was called Tolkien's Creation of the Impression of Depth. You had several categories that you talked about. And the first thing that you talked about that created this impression of depth in his lore and his mythology was the sheer size and the intricate detail of the world that he created. Is that something that you could talk a little bit about?
Yeah. So, and this is actually one of my critiques of the Peter Jackson films, as beautiful as they are, is that Middle Earth's too small in them.
Yeah.
That the elves decide to go to Helm's Deep. Bang, they're there, like later that night.
Yeah.
Whereas Tolkien really does the hard work, and if you've ever done, a big Dungeons and Dragons campaign or tried to write a fantasy novel, like just dealing with the size of things without making it boring, right. Because really a lot of it would then be, and then they walk for 4 weeks.
Yep.
And you have to do, it's not like that, right? Like, I mean, some of it's just Tolkien being really smart. Like, I'll put him in boats on the river. You can cover a lot of ground that way.
Right.
But it's both the size and at the same time the incredible detail, whether it's the naming or so when you read Tolkien, when you read Lord of the Rings out loud, you realize like just how much of the book is devoted to just describing landscape. They make the world is rendered, down to the littlest thing, to the line of beans on poles outside Tom Bombadil's house. And I think that what that, without being too, using this in a shallow way, but the fractal dimension of the work that you can zoom in as much as you want, and there's everything there. You can zoom back out to the biggest, view, and everywhere in between. And I think that helps give the impression that it's a real place.
And do you think some of this has to do with, I remember reading in your article, like, is the way he wrote things, right, over the course of his whole life. And he had like, one of my favorite characters was Turin. And I think I read in your article that there were like something like 12 different versions of the Turin-Turinbar story. Does that contribute to the size of the world in some way?
I think so, because I think that's how he started to fill in all the corners, and it's also, it creates. So last summer I had a student come all the way to Wheaton from China to study Tolkien and digital stuff, and we worked on the chapter Strider in the Lord of the Rings.
Yeah.
And that's the most revised part of the entire Lord of the Rings. And it had to keep getting revised because Tolkien came up with different reasons for why Gandalf was late, and then different reasons for like the geopolitics, and then it was just the Black Riders, and now there's Saruman, and now there's some other piece, and he kept having to change, and it forced him to change everything. Like the changes, what the student Peijian Wu, what she showed was that the changes sort of cascaded down. When you change something about the plot, it forced changes in the character, and then if you change things about the character, it forced changes in the plot. And I think that's the same sort of thing that Tolkien was getting at with all those Turin revisions. Like, he had this idea of this story, but he didn't know, do I tell it in this very mythological, pulled back, there's almost no dialogue. And when people talk, they give formal speeches, right? Or is it more zoomed in, like as he learned to write, as he wrote the Lord of the Rings, or should it be even more spare in these sort of annals? And in this year this happened, and this year that happened, or in poetry, he wrote a big chunk of the Turin story in alliterative long lines. And how should the poetry, influence the story? One of the things we were always surprised by is the Turin story reads like it was influenced by poetry, right? It has lines like Turin stood stock still and silent looking at that dreadful death, except that it turns out the most poetic sounding lines of the prose are often not from the poetry. So it's like every time he rewrote it, he kept bits of the old piece. He created new bits. Sometimes he created those new bits, I think, just from memory of the old piece rather than actually having it in front of him. And in doing that, it gets the texture of something that was put together over hundreds of years by many bards and chroniclers and writers and storytellers. But it's all from the mind of J.R.R. Tolkien. And that's just an amazing trick. Like, people try to make their work seem like that they're traditional or oral or long lost or reconstructed. He succeeded. So much so that it's actually subtle. And I mean, we were using, digital philology techniques, computer techniques to try to substantiate the feeling that we get when you read the Turin story, say in the published Silmarillion or the Narn in the Unfinished Tales, that there's multiple authors there. And I know, people say, well, Dad, the other one's Christopher. But it's not really, like not there. Yeah. Like, there's places where Christopher had to write connecting material, and you can spot it. Our Lexomics research can sort of see places where Christopher, by the way, absolutely flat out says, then there wasn't any material here. Douglas Caine has put that all together in his book on constructing Arda. But it's not that. They're all J.R.R. They're just J.R.R. over the course of 50 years. Right. And writing deliberately in different styles. I mean, Shippey always says, like, what on earth made him sit down and after he's written a lot of the Silmarillion story in the story form, I think I'll need to write the Grey Annals now. I mean, and tells the whole story in a more boring form, like more like an outline than the actual story was. And I don't think that it was so much, a plan to get that. Like, I'm not saying, like, Tolkien, I figured out that I need to rewrite my own work this way. I think it was more that he needed to see his ideas show up as if they were a history text that someone found in Rivendell. Sure. And they were a story. And then his philologist brain, what you try to train yourself to do to be a philologist is to look at damaged, confusing, or incomplete material, and Tolkien was the best at this, and figure out what the truth behind it was. Mm-hmm. Like, if you have two seemingly contradictory pieces, is there a single story that could lead to both? This comes from linguistic reconstruction. So if we have, words in Old Norse for the word for shirt is skirt in Old Norse, and it's shirt in Anglo-Saxon. Well, how did we end up in such a state of affairs? Mm-hmm. Right, and we still have both of those in modern English and so forth. So what would be the thing behind it? And in this case, it's that those words shirt and skirt both referred to the same garment, which was like a long tunic. Yeah. And when they both came into English, one from Anglo-Saxon and one from Old Norse, just one got used for the top half of that piece of clothing, and the other for the bottom half. And Tolkien wants to do this with a lot of things. So, like, Bjorn comes out of a crux in medieval literature. It's that Bjorn means bear, and it means warrior. So the question is, which comes first? Do we call a warrior a bear because he kind of looks like a bear and he's tall, strong and tall and everything, or do we call a bear like a warrior of the forest, or something like that? And people will argue back and forth, and Tolkien's answer was, yeah, both. You know what's even better? He's a warrior and he's a bear. he could be either one, and that's why it's all confused and so forth. And like that was kind of being like, flip about that one. But so many times in his work on Beowulf, in his work on Gawain and the Green Knight, his brilliance was seeing like, I can come up with a coherent story that partially misremembered or transmitted a long way gets me to both of these pieces of evidence off a single source. Mm-hmm. So, dark elves. Snorri Sturluson says that there's light elves, there's dark elves, and there's dwarves. All the other scholars coming along, like, Jacob Grimm says, well, obviously the dark elves and dwarves are the same thing. And Tolkien sort of goes, no. No, see, I had this idea that maybe, first of all, the light elves, dark elves thing are what elves call each other, but also, maybe there's this one elf who likes to only come out at night, and he hangs out with dwarves, and he dresses in black armor. There you go. Yeah. And so then you can imagine that, or you can imagine that from the way the Rohirrim think of the Lady of the Golden Wood, and they're scared of her, and she weaves her webs, but she's beautiful. This is sort of like how the Anglo-Saxons they were afraid of elves. Tolkien thought, now this has been, like, some of the scholarships change on this, but the whole elf shot thing was like when you had a sudden stitch or a sudden pain or something like that, you'd been shot by elves. But yet the Anglo-Saxons named their children things like Alfred, which means elf council, right, or Alfgifu, gift of the elves. That kind of ambivalent, and Tolkien has an explanation, right? Like, it's really dangerous to go to Lothlorien if you're a mortal, but also beautiful, So there's a few of those things.
A couple times you've mentioned someone named Tom Shippey, and I was wondering if you could. Of course, I know who he is, but I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about Tom and sort of. I know you actually you are part of the Tolkien Studies Journal, right? And
yes.
You're an editor there, and was Tom involved with that?
Well, Tom's was on our advisory board for years, but he wasn't directly involved with Tolkien Studies. Tolkien Studies came about because Doug Anderson did the annotated Hobbit, among other things. He and I were having a phone conversation in 2001, and he said something to the effect like, we have these journals, Mallorn, which is the journal of the Tolkien Society in England, and Mythlore, which is sort of American and focused on not just Tolkien, but other, fantasy writers. He said, but I've always thought that we just needed a journal of Tolkien studies that was focused on him and wasn't, and was academic and its own thing. And I said, well, we should found that. And he said, well, we should talk to my friend Verlyn Flieger. And so the three of us started working on it. We solicited articles from Tom Shippey. Had the very first article. Tom is like the dean of Tolkien scholars, and he wrote. I'll tell you about him in a sec. So I'll to the Tolkien studies stuff. We had this journal, but we had no publisher, and we tried a number of publishers, and they were like, I can't see it. We have an academic journal on Tolkien or whatever. And then I was at the International Society of Anglo-Saxonists conference in 2003, and I was talking to a guy named Patrick Connor, who's a professor at West Virginia University, and he had just taken over the press there. And he said, one of the weird things I've discovered since I took over this press is that the only thing that's profitable are journals. We don't make any money on academic books. We break even, but the journals actually do okay. I'm like, well, are you going to publish more journals then? He goes, yeah, I would like to. I wouldn't know. How do you put one together? I'm like, would you like to publish one on J.R.R. Tolkien? He's like, ooh, I think that could probably be pretty successful. And this tells you like what era this was. I pulled the CD out of my bag that I had done the journal on, that we were trying to self-publish it or whatever, and handed it to him and said, here's the first volume. And so that was great. That worked out really well.
Wow.
And then after a number of years, over 10 years, Doug moved on to other projects, and that's when David Bratman came on as the third editor. We've set it up as to have the three-headed monster, because that way there's always a way for two to outvote one, but not so, 4 you can have ties. So
Sure, yep.
So the Tom Shippey, who you'd asked about, Tom is the dean of all Tolkien scholars. His book, The Road to Middle-earth, was, it's the book that I wished I'd written, and I was planning on writing. So I really should hate Tom Shippey. When I was in grad school and I was starting to learn Old English, and I was realizing that I was seeing all this in Tolkien. And now, of course, people have been seeing this in Tolkien since the year I was born, really, but or longer. But you have this sense like, oh my gosh, I'm the first person to realize that West Fu Hal means be you well in Anglo-Saxon. Oh, I've got to write a book that explains all this stuff. And then I read The Road to Middle-earth, and I'm like, you bastard, you wrote the book that I want to write. And then I was doing research for another, so my dissertation research, part of it was on the wisdom poems in Anglo-Saxon. And so I go and, doing the bibliography search that you always have to do, and the pick thing pops up, Poems of Wisdom and Learning in Middle-earth by Tom Shippey. So then I'm co-writing an article with one of my students on Ursula Le Guin's Earthsea books. And, we're looking for articles, and there's one, Tom Shippey and the Magical Wizards of Earthsea and how they perform magic. And I'm like, damn it. So I really wanted to dislike the guy. And then I met him for the first time, and I had a question. He gave a paper, and I asked him something, and we started chatting, and he's like, well, we have to finish this over beers. And chatting 3 hours later, and I realized Tom Shippey's like the greatest guy ever. And then I worked well with him. He and I think the same way about a lot of things. But he's the guy who got it started as serious Tolkien scholarship of figuring out a way to read Tolkien. And he said, you need to understand him as a philologist because he's making jokes that are language-based. Mm-hmm. Like, all the names of the kings of Rohan are just words for king. So, like, King Theoden is King King, and King Éomer is King King, and almost everybody there is just a word for king. And, in fact, everything in Rohan is just its description in Anglo-Saxon.
Huh.
Edoras means the courts, Meduseld means mead hall, the Halifirian is the holy mountain. The wold is the rolling ground. Wet wang is the damp place.
Huh.
I mean, and he plays on that because the hobbits do that too, right? With the hill, the water, and so forth. So like part of reading, as a philologist, is reading like Tom says is like we philologists we share a bunch just the same way that like T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound, right? They knew the classics, and they knew Dante inside and out. So they're making little references to him and arguments about what it means, and playing off words or problems in there. Well, Tolkien's doing the same thing, but he's doing it with the stuff that's at the center of our field.
Yep.
And that's how Tom reads like a philologist. And then I would say that the thing that other people are doing, who've taken it up, like James with the digital side, or me, or Corey, or Dimitra Fimi, is that there's a certain kind of way to read Tolkien, which I like that line from Roman Jakobson, like go really slowly. Like a lot of the Silmarillion in particular works like Norse sagas, in that the tension is in the stuff that's not said. It's in the stuff it's in the fact that this person represents this family and this person represents this family, and they both know what the stakes are, but then the actual words they exchange are pretty trivial.
Mm-hmm.
And you don't get like a deep, the psychological insight isn't the author coming out and telling you, and Turin was conflicted because he felt that his, Thingol hadn't really done his, but he was also grateful to Thingol, but he never felt that he fit in very well as, no, it's instead like his hands tightened on his sword hilt.
Yeah.
Or there's the way that the storyteller or Tolkien, the way he structures it, right? That there's a scene of 3 times it's mentioned something about, when the obnoxious elf says, "Oh, do the women in Hithlum go running around clad only in their hair?"
Mm-hmm.
And then Turin, of course, chases him like that. And then later on, Nienor is running like that. Right? Like those layerings and the complexity of it, the author never comes in and says, "And then Turin thought of what he'd said to so-and-so." You have to put it all together,
right,
as a reader to get all of that stuff, or that the ring of Barahir that Aragorn's going to wed Arwen with is like actually that ring,
mm-hmm.
or what Aragorn's really asking of Elrond, or even things that you can only now figure out that Tolkien didn't really put in the book, like that. He then retcons it, right? That Fëanor once asked Galadriel for some locks of her hair, and she said no to Fëanor. So when Gimli asks, everyone's like, "Oh,
yeah,
yes, that." And when she says yes, "Oh, I can't believe she did that."
Yeah.
And the point is that that's there for, you can only get that as a reader. The author's not handing that to you like they would in a 20th century novel.